The thunder of hooves and gunfire echoed across the plains as Margaret Foster rode for her life, the deed to her family's ranch clutched in her trembling hand. It was 1874, and the Nebraska territory had never felt so vast and unforgiving. 3 men pursued her, their intentions as clear as the blood-red sunset stretching across the horizon. They wanted the land, they wanted the water rights, and they'd already taken everything else. Margaret's chestnut mare stumbled on the uneven ground, nearly sending her sprawling. The animal was exhausted, foam flecking its mouth after the long chase from Red Cloud. Margaret knew she couldn't outrun them forever, not with night approaching and her horse failing beneath her. "Just a little further, girl," she whispered, leaning forward against the mare's neck. "Please, just a little more." The town of Riverton appeared in the distance, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the prairie winds. It wasn't much not compared to the growing settlement of Red Cloud 20 miles back, but it represented her only hope. Someone there might help her. Someone might stand against the Blackwell brothers who'd murdered her father and were now determined to seize everything the Fosters had built over the past 15 years. As she entered the town, Margaret slowed her horse to a walk, painfully aware of the stares from the handful of people on the street. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dust and tears, her honey blonde hair falling loose from its pins. She must look like a madwoman. The mare's legs buckled as they reached what passed for the town square, and Margaret barely managed to dismount before the exhausted animal collapsed to its knees. She stroked the mare's sweating neck, whispering apologies as she cast desperate glances over her shoulder. "The Blackwells would be here soon. Minutes, perhaps, miss. You all right?" An old man approached cautiously, eyeing her disheveled appearance. "Please," Margaret gasped, her voice hoarse from dust and fear. "They're coming. They killed my father and they're coming for me." The old man's eyes widened. Without another word, he took her elbow and guided her toward a squat building with a hand-painted sign, "Pearson's Auction House and General Store." "Jim Pearson's a fair man. He's got the sheriff's ear, too. Come on now." Inside, the auction was already underway. A dozen men filled the cramped space, their attention fixed on a thin man with spectacles who stood behind a small wooden podium. At their entrance, several heads turned. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, the curiosity and judgment they contained. "Jim," the old man called out, still gripping Margaret's arm, "this lady needs help. Says there's men after her." The auctioneer paused, peering at Margaret over his spectacles. The room fell silent. "They killed my father," Margaret said, her voice stronger now despite the fear clawing at her throat. "The Blackwell brothers. They want our ranch the water rights for their cattle. I have the deed, but they're right behind me." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses approaching filled the room. Through the grimy window, Margaret could see 3 riders pulling up outside, dust swirling around them in the fading light. "Them's the Blackwells, all right," someone muttered. "Mean as snakes, the lot of them." "Please," Margaret said, looking from face to face, finding only averted eyes and nervous expressions. "They'll kill me too if they find me." The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Miss, this is a business establishment. We don't want any trouble." The door slammed open. 3 men stood silhouetted against the dying light, gun belts prominent against their dusty clothes. The largest one, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes cold as winter, stepped forward. "Evening, gentlemen," he drawled, his gaze finding Margaret instantly. "I see our runaway has found herself some new friends." "This ain't your concern, Blackwell," the auctioneer said, but his voice wavered. "Oh, but it is." Blackwell smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "This woman's father owed us money, lots of it, and now she's stolen something of ours." "That's a lie," Margaret stepped forward, clutching the deed tighter. You murdered him because he wouldn't sell. Blackwell's smile vanished. Watch your tongue, girl, or you'll join him. A tense silence fell over the room. Margaret could feel her courage failing, the overwhelming odds against her becoming painfully clear. These men wouldn't help her. They feared the Blackwells too much. Now, Blackwell continued, we can do this easy or hard. Hand over that deed and we'll be on our way. Margaret looked around desperately. The old man who had helped her had backed away. The auctioneer studied his ledger with sudden intensity. No one would meet her eyes. I can't, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's all I have left. Then we do it hard. Blackwell nodded to his brothers, who spread out, hands hovering near their guns. Margaret felt something inside her crumble. Her father had died trying to protect their land. Her mother, years before, had succumbed to the harsh prairie winters. Everything she had endured, everything she had fought for, was slipping away. Fine, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Take it. She held out the creased paper with trembling fingers, her courage finally, completely gone. In that moment she felt utterly alone. Not today. The voice came from the back of the room. Deep and steady, it cut through the tense silence like a knife. All heads turned toward a tall figure who rose from his seat in the corner, a man Margaret hadn't noticed before. He moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to danger, his spurs jingling softly as he stepped into the lamplight. Dust covered his clothes, and a week's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, but there was nothing unkempt about the way he held himself, or the steady look in his blue eyes. This doesn't concern you, stranger, Blackwell said, his hand inching toward his holster. I'm making it my concern. The stranger's gaze flicked to Margaret, then back to Blackwell. 3 men hunting down a woman half their size seems like the kind of thing that should concern any decent man. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt a flicker of hope as the stranger continued to advance, positioning himself between her and the Blackwells. Name's Hayes Cooper, he said, not to Blackwell but to Margaret, and I think these gentlemen were just leaving. You're outnumbered, Cooper, one of the other Blackwells sneered. Hayes smiled, but there was no humor in it. Am I? As if on cue, the click of a shotgun being cocked echoed in the room. The auctioneer had produced a weapon from beneath his podium. Blackwell, you and your brothers have caused enough trouble in this county, the auctioneer said, his earlier timidity gone. Miss Foster's right, everyone knows you've been trying to force out the smaller ranchers. Other men in the room stood up straighter, and Margaret noticed hands moving toward concealed weapons. The mood had shifted, catalyzed by Hayes Cooper's stand. The eldest Blackwell's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Margaret thought he might draw anyway, might risk everything in a furious gamble. Then, slowly, deliberately, he spat on the floor. This ain't over, he said. Not by a long shot. You've made an enemy today, Cooper. Wouldn't be the first time, Hayes replied calmly. With final venomous glares, the Blackwells backed out of the auction house. The sound of their horses galloping away broke the tension, and the room collectively exhaled. Margaret found herself staring at Hayes Cooper, this stranger who had stood up when no one else would. He turned to face her, and she was struck by the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength in his weathered features. Thank you, she said, the words wholly inadequate. Don't thank me yet, Miss Foster. Those men won't give up easy. He glanced at the deed still clutched in her hand. That must be mighty valuable land. It's not the land, really. It's the creek that runs through it. It's the only year-round water source for miles in that direction. She hesitated. How did you know my name? Heard it mentioned. He nodded toward the document. That the deed? Margaret nodded, suddenly wary again despite his help. Hayes seemed to sense her caution. I'm not after your land, madam, just trying to understand what we're up against. The word caught her by surprise. Those men will be back and with more guns next time. You'll need help. The auctioneer approached, shotgun now resting in the crook of his arm. Cooper's right, Miss Foster. The Blackwells don't take kindly to being crossed, but you've got friends here now. Margaret looked from the auctioneer to Hayes Cooper, trying to process this sudden shift in fortune. An hour ago, she had been alone and hunted. Now, somehow, she had allies. I don't understand, she said. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Hayes Cooper's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Let's just say I've got my reasons for disliking men like the Blackwells. He paused. Your horse is done in. You got somewhere to stay tonight. The practicality of the question brought Margaret back to reality. She shook her head. I was running. I didn't plan beyond reaching town. Mrs. Holloway runs a decent boarding house, the auctioneer offered. She'd take you in. And your mare can rest in my stable, added another man, stepping forward. No charge. Margaret felt tears threatening again, but of a different kind this time. Thank you, all of you. As the auction dispersed, Hayes Cooper fell into step beside her as they walked toward the boarding house. In the fading light, with the first stars appearing overhead, Margaret studied him surreptitiously. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 35 to her 22, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years in the sun. His clothes were trail-worn but well-kept, and the gun at his hip looked like a familiar extension of himself rather than an accessory. "Why did you do it?" she asked as they reached the boarding house porch. "Stand up for me, I mean." Hayes Cooper was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light of day was fading. "Because 15 years ago nobody stood up for my family," he finally said. "And I've been regretting it ever since." With that cryptic statement, he tipped his hat and turned away, leaving Margaret to wonder about the man who had saved both her life and her future with a simple, powerful declaration. Not today. Dawn broke over Riverton with a rosy glow that belied the tension in the air. Margaret awoke in the Spartan but clean room of Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, momentarily disoriented until the previous day's events came rushing back. Her father, the ranch, the Blackwells, and Hayes Cooper, the mysterious cowboy who had stood up when her courage had failed. She dressed quickly in her travel-worn clothes, pinning her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. The deed to the Foster ranch remained tucked inside her bodice, close to her heart. It represented everything now: her past, her present, and whatever uncertain future lay ahead. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the modest dining room. "You're up early, dear," Mrs. Holloway said, setting a steaming cup of coffee before Margaret without being asked. "Sleep well as could be expected," Margaret replied honestly. "Thank you for taking me in." "Nonsense. Any friend of Hayes Cooper is welcome here." The older woman's expression softened. "That man's done more good turns in this county than most care to acknowledge." Margaret's curiosity stirred. "You know him well. He passes through now and then, keeps to himself mostly, but he's always been fair. Paid me for a month's board once when my husband was laid up with a broken leg." Mrs. Holloway placed a plate of eggs and bacon before her. "Eat up. You'll need your strength." Margaret had just finished her breakfast when the boarding house door opened, and Hayes Cooper himself stepped inside. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. In the morning light, Margaret noticed a thin scar running along his jawline, partially hidden by stubble. "Miss Foster," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I expected to," she admitted. "Mr. Cooper, Hayes," he corrected her. "Just Hayes is fine." Hayes, then, I owe you an explanation about yesterday. He shook his head. Not here. Town's already buzzing with talk. Best we speak somewhere more private. Mrs. Holloway, who had been listening unabashedly, nodded in agreement. The Blackwells have friends in town. Walls have ears. Hayes gestured toward the door. Your horse is rested. Thought we might ride out a ways, let you tell your story without an audience. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. Something about Hayes' Cooper inspired trust, despite his reticence. Let me get my things. 20 minutes later, they were riding side by side along a trail that wound through the rolling grasslands east of town. Margaret's mare, refreshed after a night's rest, moved easily beside Hayes's big gray gelding. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of prairie flowers and distant rain. My father came to Nebraska in '59, Margaret began without preamble. I was 7. Mother died that first winter pneumonia, but father was determined to make a go of it. Hayes listened silently, his gaze scanning the horizon as they rode. We built the ranch from nothing. Foster Creek, he called it, for the stream that runs through the property. It's not much, but it's one of the few water sources that doesn't dry up in summer. That's what makes it valuable. And that's why the Blackwells want it, Hayes added. Margaret nodded. They moved into the territory 3 years ago. Started buying up land, running more cattle than the ground could support. They need water rights to expand further. She swallowed hard. At first they tried to buy us out. When father refused, the accidents started. Accidents, fences cut, cattle stampeded, a mysterious fire in our barn. Margaret's voice hardened. Then last week, father went to Red Cloud to meet with a lawyer about filing formal complaints. He never made it home. Hayes reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face her fully. They killed him, shot in the back on the trail home. The sheriff said it was likely bandits. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. But nothing was taken, not his horse, not his money, nothing except the legal papers he was carrying. And nobody questioned it. The Blackwells have friends in high places. Money talks. She took a deep breath. The very next day, Silas Blackwell, the oldest brother, showed up at the ranch. Said father had agreed to sell before his unfortunate accident and demanded I honor the deal. But you had the deed, Hayes said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Father always kept it hidden in a strong box beneath a floorboard in his room. The Blackwells didn't know about it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I grabbed it and ran while they were searching the house. Took them by surprise. Hayes was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. You're a brave woman, Margaret Foster, she shook her head. Not brave enough. I was ready to give up yesterday. Being afraid doesn't make you a coward. Standing alone against men like that would terrify anyone. His voice was quiet but firm. You made it to Riverton alive. That took courage. Margaret studied him, this enigmatic man who had stepped into her life at its lowest point. Why are you helping me, Hayes? Really? He gazed out across the prairie, seemingly weighing his words. I told you I had my reasons for disliking the Blackwells. Yes, but they remind me of a man named Garrett, Richard Garrett. His jaw tightened. 15 years ago, he did to my family what the Blackwells are trying to do to you. Only difference is he succeeded. Understanding bloomed in Margaret. In Wyoming. Hayes looked at her sharply. How did you know? You said last night that nobody stood up for your family 15 years ago. And there was that range war in Wyoming territory around that time. Father used to talk about it, how the big cattle interests drove out the smaller ranchers. He nodded slowly. I was 20. My father had a small spread near the Bighorn. Not much, but it was ours. His voice took on a distant quality. Garrett wanted it for the water rights. The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Margaret. What happened? Same story as yours at first, threats, accidents. Then one night they came. Garrett and his men burned us out. His knuckles whitened on the reins. My father died in the fire. Mother and sister escaped, but they had nowhere to go. No money, no home. I'm so sorry, Margaret said softly. I was in Cheyenne when it happened, working a job to earn extra money for the ranch. By the time I got back, it was too late. Hayes's face was impassive, but Margaret could sense the old pain beneath the surface. Mother took my sister east to live with relatives. I stayed, to fight Garrett. A humorless smile touched his lips. That was the plan, but I was young, alone. Garrett had the law, the money, the guns. I tried, but... He trailed off, then met her eyes directly. When I saw you yesterday, standing alone against the Blackwells, it was like seeing my own past. Only this time, I could do something about it. The simple honesty of his words touched Margaret deeply. Here was a man who understood exactly what she faced because he had lived it himself. The connection between them, forged in similar suffering, felt suddenly powerful and profound. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Hayes turned his horse back toward town. "First, we need allies. The Blackwells won't give up, and we need to be ready when they make their next move. Who would stand with us? You saw how it was in town before you spoke up. People are afraid, not heartless. Sometimes they just need someone to take the first step." He glanced at her. "Besides, I know a few men who owe me favors. Good men with steady hands and sharp eyes." As they rode back toward Riverton, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Hope. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there, kindled by this quiet man with old wounds and steady resolve. What she didn't yet understand was that in helping her fight for her home, Hayes Cooper would find something he had lost 15 years ago on a burned-out ranch in Wyoming. Something he had long believed beyond recovery, his own redemption. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Hayes quietly assembled a group of men willing to stand against the Blackwells. Word had spread through Riverton about Margaret Foster's plight, and to her surprise, support had begun to crystallize around her cause. Other small ranchers, storekeepers who resented the Blackwells' arrogance, even a former deputy who had left his badge behind after one too many conflicts with the powerful family, all came forward offering help. Hayes coordinated their efforts from Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, which had become an unofficial headquarters. Maps of the county were spread across the dining table, marking the Blackwells' ranch, the routes to Foster Creek, and potential ambush points. Margaret found herself impressed by Hayes's methodical approach. He wasn't just a man good with a gun. He had a tactical mind that considered every angle of their situation. "The problem isn't just defending your ranch," he explained on the third evening as they sat reviewing their plans. "It's proving the Blackwells killed your father. Without that, they'll just keep coming, legal or not." "The sheriff won't help," Margaret said, frustration evident in her voice. "He's practically in their pocket. Then we need evidence he can't ignore." Hayes tapped the map where it showed the trail between Red Cloud and Foster Creek. "Your father was killed somewhere along here," Margaret nodded. "About 7 miles out of Red Cloud where the trail passes through Harper's Gulch." "Good ambush spot," one of the men, a former cavalry scout named Miller, observed. "Lots of cover, narrow passage." "The body?" Hayes asked quietly. Margaret swallowed hard. "The sheriff's men brought him back to Foster Creek. I buried him on the hill behind the house." Hayes's expression softened momentarily. "I'm sorry you had to do that alone." A brief silence fell over the room, heavy with shared understanding of her loss. "What about the bullet?" asked Richardson, the former deputy. "Was it recovered?" Margaret frowned. "I don't know. The sheriff didn't mention it." "Might still be at the scene then," Hayes said, thinking aloud. "If we could find it, match it to one of the Blackwell's guns." That would be something, Richardson agreed. But those boys are careful. They'd have used a common caliber, nothing distinctive. Still worth looking. Hayes rolled up the map decisively. First light tomorrow, Miss Foster and I will ride to Harper's Gulch. The rest of you keep watch in town. The Blackwells have been quiet, too quiet. They're planning something. As the men filed out, Margaret remained at the table, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they were attempting. Going back to the place where her father had been murdered, confronting the Blackwells, possibly facing gunfire, it all seemed impossible just days ago. Yet here she was, at the center of an impromptu resistance, having second thoughts. Hayes asked, noticing her expression as he cleared away the maps. "Not about fighting back," she said. "But all these men, they're risking their lives for my ranch, my fight. It's not just your fight anymore." Hayes sat down across from her. "The Blackwells have made enemies throughout the county. What happened to your father was the last straw for many folks. Still, I never expected such support. People surprise you sometimes." A rare smile touched his lips, especially when someone shows them it's possible to stand up. Margaret studied him in the lamplight. Over the past few days, working closely together, she had begun to see beyond the stoic exterior. Hayes Cooper was a complex man, guarded yet compassionate, serious yet occasionally revealing flashes of dry humor. And despite his attempts to maintain professional distance, she had caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unguarded. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked. "Organized men made plans like this." He hesitated before answering. "After Wyoming, I drifted, took whatever work I could find, some of it required similar skills. You were a lawman for a time, marshal in a small Colorado town, before that scout for the Army," he shrugged. "Did some work for the Pinkerton Agency too. And now I mind my own business and try to stay out of trouble." His mouth quirked. "Usually," Margaret laughed softly, "until a desperate woman rides into an auction house with 3 angry men on her trail. Something like that." His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the attraction between them, unspoken but increasingly undeniable, seemed to fill the space between them. Mrs. Holloway's arrival in the dining room broke the moment. "Letter came for you, Mr. Cooper. Boy brought it from the telegraph office." Hayes accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks. As he read the contents, his expression darkened. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Trouble." He handed her the telegram. "The Blackwells have hired guns, 6 men professionals arriving in Red Cloud tomorrow." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she read the terse warning from Hayes's contact in Red Cloud. How did they arrange this so quickly? Men like the Blackwells always have contingency plans. Hayes's voice was grim. "Changes our timeline, though. We need to move faster. The scene investigation, still important, but we need to secure your ranch first, if they get there before us." He let the implication hang. Margaret nodded, understanding instantly. "They'll destroy the deed, claim squatters' rights, make it their word against mine." "Exactly. And with hired guns backing them up, they'd be hard to dislodge, legal claim or not." Hayes stood, decision made. "We ride for Foster Creek tonight. 4 hours hard riding should get us there before dawn. Tonight. But the men, Richardson can bring them tomorrow. But you and I need to get there first, establish your presence." He was already moving, gathering his gear with efficient movements. "Pack only what you need. We travel light and fast." Within 30 minutes, they were mounted and riding east under a star-filled sky. Margaret led the way, knowing every inch of the trail to her home. The night was clear and cool, a half-moon providing just enough light to navigate by. They rode mostly in silence, conserving their horses' strength for the long journey. Occasionally, Hayes would ask about landmarks or potential hazards ahead, but otherwise, each was lost in their own thoughts. For Margaret, those thoughts increasingly centered on the man riding beside her. In less than a week, Hayes Cooper had transformed from stranger to ally to something more complicated. She was drawn to him in a way that went beyond gratitude for his help or admiration for his courage. There was an understanding between them, a connection forged by shared experiences and mutual respect. As the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, Margaret found herself wondering what would happen after this was over, assuming they survived the confrontation with the Blackwells. Would Hayes simply ride away, continuing his solitary existence? The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. They stopped briefly at midnight to rest the horses and drink from a stream. The prairie stretched around them, vast and silent under the moon's silver light. "We're making good time," Hayes said, checking his pocket watch. "Should reach Foster Creek well before dawn." Margaret nodded, suddenly anxious about returning home. The last time she had seen it, she had been fleeing for her life. What condition would it be in now? Had the Blackwells ransacked it further, Hayes seemed to sense her unease. "You all right? Just thinking about the ranch, about Father." She gazed toward the eastern horizon. "It's strange. All my life that place was home, safe, familiar. Now it feels like riding into battle." "It won't always feel that way," he said softly. "Once this is over, you'll make it a home again." Margaret turned to look at him directly. "And where will you be when this is over?" The question hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Hayes hesitated, his usual composure briefly faltering. "I don't usually plan that far ahead," he finally said. "Perhaps you should start." Margaret's voice was quiet but steady. "Some things are worth planning for." Before he could respond, a distant sound caught their attention: horses, moving fast. "Riders," Hayes said, instantly alert. "Coming this way." They moved quickly, leading their mounts into a shallow depression screened by tall grass. Crouching low, they watched as a group of horsemen passed about 200 yards to the north, silhouetted against the night sky. "6 men," Hayes whispered, confirming their worst fears. "Blackwells and their hired guns, heading straight for Foster Creek." "They're going to get there before us," Margaret said, panic rising in her throat. "No, they won't." Hayes's voice was steel. "Because we're taking a shortcut." "There is no shortcut, not one that's passable at night." "You mentioned a creek that runs through your property, the one the Blackwells want so badly. Does it run south of here?" Understanding dawned on Margaret's face. "Foster Creek? Yes, about a mile south. But Hayes, the banks are steep in places, and at night, it's our only chance. If we follow the creek bed, we can cut straight to your ranch while they take the main trail." He was already mounting his horse. "You know that creek better than anyone. You can guide us." It was dangerous, potentially deadly if their horses stumbled in the dark creek bed. But Margaret knew he was right. It was their only hope of reaching Foster Creek before the Blackwells. "Follow me," she said, swinging into her saddle, "and pray for moonlight." The next 2 hours were among the most harrowing of Margaret's life. They rode along the creek bed where possible, scrambling up and down the banks when necessary. The half-moon provided just enough light to avoid disaster, but more than once, their horses nearly lost their footing on the slippery stones. Hayes followed without complaint, trusting her knowledge of the terrain. His quiet confidence bolstered her own, and gradually, the familiar landmarks of home began to appear. The lightning-struck oak that marked the eastern boundary of Foster land. The distinctive rock formation locals called the Sentinel. The gentle rise that would eventually lead to the ranch house itself. "We're close," Margaret whispered as they paused to water the horses. "Less than a mile now. The house is just beyond that ridge." Hayes nodded, checking his Winchester rifle before returning it to its scabbard. "We approach quiet from the west. With luck, we'll get inside before they arrive." The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky as they crested the final hill and Foster Creek Ranch came into view. The modest two-story house stood dark and silent, flanked by a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. To Margaret's relief, everything appeared untouched since her flight days earlier. They dismounted in the shelter of the barn, moving silently across the yard to the house. Margaret unlocked the door with trembling hands, memories of her father threatening to overwhelm her as they stepped inside. "We don't have much time," Hayes said gently, bringing her back to the present. "Where would be the best place to defend from?" Margaret gathered herself. "The second floor. There's a bedroom with windows facing the main trail." They moved through the house, Hayes taking note of sight lines and potential vulnerabilities. Upstairs, Margaret led him to what had been her father's room, with its clear view of the approaching trail. "Perfect," Hayes muttered, positioning himself by the window. "We'll see them coming." Margaret touched his arm. "There's something I need to get first." She crossed to the far corner of the room and knelt, prying up a loose floorboard to reveal a small cavity. From it, she withdrew a wooden box. "Father's old service revolver," she explained, opening the box to reveal a well-maintained Colt Navy. "And ammunition." Hayes raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You know how to use it. Father taught me years ago." She checked the cylinder with practiced hands. Said a woman alone on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. "Smart man," Hayes said with a nod of approval. They settled in to wait, watching the trail for any sign of the Blackwells. As the sky lightened from gray to pink, tension mounted between them. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind through the grass outside set their nerves on edge. "When this is over," Hayes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "what will you do with the ranch?" The question surprised Margaret. "Keep it running, I suppose. It's all I have left." "Big responsibility for one person." "I managed most of it already these past few years. Father's health wasn't good." She glanced at him. "What about you? Will you go back to drifting?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about settling down. Finding a place that needs a man who can handle trouble." Before Margaret could respond, a movement on the trail caught her eye. "They're coming." Through the growing light, they could see 6 riders approaching at a steady pace. The Blackwell brothers rode in front, with their hired guns following close behind. All were heavily armed. "Remember," Hayes said, his voice calm despite the impending confrontation, "we have the advantage. They don't know we're here, and they don't know about Richardson and the others coming behind them." Margaret nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. In a matter of minutes, the riders reached the ranch yard, dismounting with the casual confidence of men who expected no resistance. "Check the house," Silas Blackwell ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Find that deed, and if the Foster woman shows up, well." He laughed, the sound chilling Margaret to the bone. "Make sure she has an accident." As the men spread out, Hayes turned to Margaret. "Stay here. If anyone comes through that door besides me, shoot them." With that, he was gone, moving silently down the stairs. Margaret positioned herself beside the window, the Colt steady in her hands as she watched the men below. 2 headed for the barn, 2 for the outbuildings, while Silas Blackwell and 1 gunman approached the house. The sound of the front door opening sent her heart racing. Heavy footsteps moved through the rooms below, accompanied by the crash of furniture being overturned in their search. "Nothing down here," Silas called. "Check upstairs." Footsteps on the stairs. Margaret raised the Colt, aiming at the doorway. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the steps grew closer. Then from outside came the sound that changed everything. Gunshots followed by shouts of alarm. Hayes had made his move. The footsteps on the stairs reversed direction. Through the window, Margaret saw the hired guns running for cover as Hayes, using the barn for protection, fired methodically at their positions. Silas Blackwell emerged from the house, rage contorting his features as he realized the trap they'd walked into. "Kill him!" he roared, drawing his own weapon. Margaret didn't hesitate. Leaning out the window, she fired at Silas, the bullet striking near his feet. He looked up, shock replacing anger when he saw her. "The next one won't miss," she called down, chambering another round. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Hayes, moving with the skill of a seasoned fighter, kept the hired guns pinned down while Margaret maintained her position at the window, preventing Silas from reaching cover. One of the gunmen fell, clutching his shoulder. Another tried to make a dash for the horses, only to be driven back by Hayes's accurate fire. It was clear the tide had turned against the Blackwells, even without the reinforcements that were still hours away. "Blackwell," Hayes called out during a lull in the shooting. "It's over. Throw down your guns and ride out, or the next ones won't be warning shots." For a tense moment, it seemed Silas might choose to fight to the end. Then, with a curse that carried across the yard, he signaled his surrender. "This isn't over," he snarled as he and his men backed toward their horses, hands raised. "You'll regret this day, Cooper." "I doubt that," Hayes replied evenly. "Ride out, now, and if you value your lives, don't come back." Margaret watched, hardly daring to believe it, as the Blackwells and their hired guns mounted and rode away. One of the wounded men slumped in his saddle. Only when they had disappeared from sight did she lower the Colt, her hands suddenly shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Moments later, Hayes appeared in the doorway, his face smudged with gunpowder but otherwise unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Hayes crossed the room in 3 strides, and without hesitation, she stepped into his arms. He held her tightly as the emotions of the past days finally overwhelmed her: grief for her father, fear for her future, relief at their victory, all mingling together in a storm of feeling. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now. Your home is safe." When she finally pulled back to look at him, something had changed between them. The connection that had been building since that first day in the auction house had crystallized into something undeniable. "You saved my life," she said softly. "My home. Everything." Hayes shook his head. "You saved yourself, Margaret. I just helped a little along the way." In the golden light of morning that flooded through the window, with the danger past and their futures suddenly wide open before them, Margaret Foster did something she had been wanting to do since the moment Hayes Cooper had stood up in that auction house and said, "Not today." She kissed him. The days that followed brought swift changes to both Foster Creek and the county at large. Richardson arrived with reinforcements several hours after the Blackwells' retreat, expecting a fight only to find Hayes and Margaret calmly sharing breakfast in the ranch house kitchen. Their disappointment at missing the action was tempered by news that the county sheriff was on his way, summoned by an urgent telegram Hayes had sent before leaving Riverton. "The Blackwells' influence isn't what it used to be," Hayes explained as they waited for the lawman's arrival. "There's been talk in the territorial capital about their business practices. This incident might be the push needed for a proper investigation." He was right. The sheriff arrived with a federal marshal in tow, a development that surprised even Hayes. It seemed the Blackwells had drawn attention far beyond Webster County, with allegations of land fraud, intimidation, and now murder bringing official scrutiny. Margaret's testimony about her father's death. Combined with evidence they recovered from the ambush site the following day, including the bullet that matched one of Silas Blackwell's guns, was enough to issue warrants. Within a week, all three Blackwell brothers were in custody, their hired guns scattered to the winds. As spring blossomed across the prairie, Foster Creek Ranch began to recover from the shadow that had hung over it. Margaret threw herself into work mending fences, tending livestock, planting the vegetable garden her father had always maintained. Hayes stayed, his initial offer of temporary help evolving into something more permanent as the days passed. They worked side by side, rebuilding what had been damaged and creating something new in the process. Margaret found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way sunlight caught in his hair, how his hands moved with gentle strength, whether tending an injured calf or replacing worn boards on the barn. She noticed how he seemed more relaxed with each passing day, the vigilant tension gradually easing from his shoulders. For Hayes, Foster Creek offered something he had never expected to find again: a sense of belonging. The ranch work suited him, engaging both body and mind in tangible, meaningful ways. But more than that, it was Margaret's presence that anchored him, her resilience, her quiet humor, her growing confidence as she reclaimed her home and her life. Their first kiss on that fateful morning had not been discussed, but neither had it been forgotten. Instead, it lingered between them like a promise, coloring their interactions with an awareness that transcended words. They moved around each other with the careful consideration of people discovering a new and precious equilibrium, neither wanting to disrupt the delicate balance they had found. 6 weeks after the confrontation with the Blackwells, news reached them that Silas and his brothers had been formally charged with the murder of John Foster. The trial would be held in the fall, with both Margaret and Hayes called to testify. That evening, they sat on the porch as twilight settled over the land, the first fireflies of summer beginning to flicker among the tall grass. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of Hayes's rocking chair. "I received a letter today," Margaret said eventually, "from a cousin back east. She offered to come help me run the ranch." Hayes's hand stilled on the arm of his chair. "You thinking of accepting?" "I was." She turned to look at him directly. "But then I realized I don't need her help. I already have a partner." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Is that what I am?" Hayes asked, his voice carefully neutral. "A partner." Margaret set aside her own chair and moved to stand before him, gathering her courage. "That depends on you, Hayes Cooper." "On what you want." He rose slowly, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "I think you know what I want, Margaret, have since that morning after the shootout." "Say it anyway," she whispered. "I need to hear it." Hayes took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I want to stay, not as a hired hand or a temporary helper. I want to build something here with you." The simple honesty of his words washed over her like a blessing. "I want that too, more than anything." This time, it was Hayes who closed the distance between them, his kiss deep and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. When they finally parted, the night had fully settled around them, stars blanketing the vast Nebraska sky. "I should have asked this weeks ago," Hayes said, his forehead resting against hers. "But things were complicated and I wanted to be sure you weren't just grateful for the help." Margaret smiled, understanding his hesitation. "And now I know it's more than that for both of us." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "Margaret Foster, would you consider becoming my wife, making this place our home together?" The answer had been forming in her heart since that day in Riverton, when a stranger had stood up in an auction house, and changed the course of her life with two simple words. "Yes," she said, the single syllable containing all the certainty she felt. "Yes, Hayes Cooper, I will." Their wedding took place in late June. A simple ceremony in the Riverton church with Mrs. Holloway, Richardson, and the other men who had stood with them against the Blackwells in attendance. The town had embraced their story, the brave woman who had fought for her home, the mysterious cowboy who had found redemption in helping her, and the celebration afterwards spilled into the streets, lasting well into the evening. As summer deepened into fall, Foster Creek Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. Hayes's experience with cattle and Margaret's knowledge of the land complemented each other perfectly, resulting in a prosperous operation that promised to grow even stronger in the coming years. The trial of the Blackwell brothers in October brought a measure of justice for John Foster's murder. All three were convicted, with Silas sentenced to hang and his brothers facing lengthy prison terms. For Margaret, the verdict brought closure rather than joy, a closing of one chapter so another could begin. With winter approaching, they focused on preparing the ranch for the harsh Nebraska weather. Additional hands were hired, the barn was reinforced, and supplies were laid in to last through the cold months ahead. Throughout it all, Hayes and Margaret worked as true partners, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome, each quiet evening spent planning their future. On a crisp December morning, with the first heavy snow of the season blanketing the land in white, Margaret woke early to find Hayes already gone from their bed. Following the sound of hammering, she discovered him in the small room adjacent to their bedroom, carefully installing a wooden railing along the wall. "Hayes," she questioned, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "What are you doing?" He turned, a rare full smile lighting his face when he saw her. "Building a cradle. Thought I'd get an early start." Margaret's hand instinctively went to her stomach, where their child, only recently confirmed by the doctor in Red Cloud, grew within her. "It's a bit soon, don't you think?" "We have months yet." Hayes set down his hammer, crossing to take her in his arms. "I know, but I want everything to be ready." He rested his hand over hers. "A home should be prepared for its future." The tenderness in his voice moved her deeply. This man, who had once been so guarded, now spoke openly of future, of home, of family concepts that had seemed beyond his reach for so many years. "You ever think about that day?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. "In Riverton at the auction house." "Often," he admitted. "It was the first time in 15 years I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be." Margaret tilted her head to look up at him. "When I lost my courage, when you found it again," he corrected gently. "When we both did." Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping Foster Creek Ranch in a peaceful blanket of white. Inside, Margaret and Hayes Cooper held each other, secure in the knowledge that what they had built together, their home, their love, their future, was strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. For a woman who had once lost everything, and a man who had wandered for years seeking redemption, it was more than enough. It was everything. Spring 1876 brought new life to Foster Creek Ranch in more ways than one. The pastures greened early that year, promising excellent grazing for their expanding herd. Wildflowers carpeted the prairie in waves of color that changed weekly, first the delicate white of prairie anemones, then the vibrant purple of wild indigo, followed by the cheerful yellow of black-eyed Susans. But the most significant new life arrived on a warm May evening, as twilight settled over the land. After hours of labor, Margaret gave birth to a son, a robust baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's piercing blue eyes. "Henry John Cooper," Hayes announced proudly to the small gathering of friends who had maintained a vigil outside during the birth. Mrs. Holloway, who had come from Riverton to assist with the delivery, beamed with grandmotherly pride as she presented the infant to the well-wishers. Inside, Margaret rested against fresh pillows, exhausted but radiant as Hayes returned to her side, cradling their son with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "He's perfect," she whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Just like his mother," Hayes replied, his voice rough with emotion as he placed Henry in her arms. "You amaze me, Margaret Cooper." The transition to parenthood brought new rhythms to their life together. Henry proved to be a good-natured baby, curious about the world and quick to smile. Hayes took to fatherhood with surprising ease, often wearing his son in a sling across his chest while he went about his daily tasks around the ranch. "Never thought I'd see Hayes Cooper singing lullabies," Richardson commented during one of his frequent visits. "Quite a change from the man I met 2 years ago," Margaret smiled, watching from the porch as Hayes showed Henry a butterfly that had landed on the corral fence. "He's found his place," she said simply. "We both have." As Henry grew from infant to toddler, Foster Creek Ranch continued to prosper. The reputation of their cattle improved with each season, bringing better prices at market. They hired additional hands, built a new bunkhouse, and expanded the main house to accommodate their growing family and frequent visitors. The changes went beyond the physical. Hayes, once known for his reticence, became a respected figure in the county, serving on the school board, helping organize the annual Harvest Festival, even occasionally assisting the new sheriff when particularly difficult situations arose. His past experience with tracking and peacekeeping proved valuable in a region still being tamed. Margaret, meanwhile, discovered unexpected passion for breeding and training horses. What began as a small side project improving their own stock for ranch work developed into a significant part of their operation. By the time Henry was walking, Foster Creek horses were sought after throughout the territory for their intelligence, endurance, and steady temperament. "Your father would be proud," Mrs. Holloway told Margaret during a summer visit as they watched Henry toddle after a clutch of chickens in the yard. "Of all you've built here." "I like to think so," Margaret agreed. "Sometimes I still expect to see him walking up from the creek, checking the water levels or looking for strays." "That's how it is with the people we love," the older woman said wisely. "They never really leave us." In the autumn of 1877, a letter arrived that would once again alter the course of their lives. It came from Wyoming territory, addressed to Hayes in a spidery hand he recognized immediately. "My mother," he explained to Margaret as he broke the seal with uncharacteristic urgency. "I haven't heard from her in nearly a year." Margaret watched his expression as he read, noting the subtle shifts from surprise to contemplation to determination. "What is it?" she asked when he finally set the letter down. "Richard Garrett is dead," Hayes said, naming the man who had destroyed his family's ranch so many years ago. "Natural causes, apparently. His holdings are being divided and sold off." Margaret understood immediately the significance. "Including your family's land," Hayes nodded. "According to Mother, the executor is looking to sell quickly. The land has been neglected. Garrett used it mainly for grazing rights, never developed it properly." A thoughtful silence fell between them. Margaret could see her husband's mind working, calculating possibilities, weighing options against obligations. "You want to buy it back," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I've thought about it over the years," Hayes admitted. "Never seemed possible before, but now." "Now we could do it," Margaret finished. Foster Creek's success had left them with substantial savings, and their credit was excellent with the bank in Red Cloud. Hayes looked at her, his expression unusually vulnerable. "It would mean dividing our attention, our resources." running two operations hundreds of miles apart, or expanding in a new direction. Margaret's practical mind was already considering alternatives. The railroad makes travel between Nebraska and Wyoming much easier than it was even 5 years ago. And Richardson has been asking for more responsibility here. You'd be willing to try? Hayes asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Hayes Cooper, when you found me in that auction house, I was ready to give up everything I had ever worked for. You taught me to fight for what matters. She squeezed his hand. Your family's land matters, to you and therefore to me. The decision, once made, set in motion a flurry of activity. Hayes traveled to Wyoming to survey the property and negotiate the purchase, while Margaret reorganized Foster Creek's operations to accommodate their expanded vision. Richardson was promoted to foreman, with clear instructions and authority to manage day-to-day affairs during their absences. Hayes returned from Wyoming with mixed emotions: joy at reclaiming his heritage, sorrow at seeing how much had changed, determination to restore what had been lost. The house is gone, he told Margaret as they sat by the fire that night. Nothing left but the foundation stones and the old well. But the land itself, he shook his head in wonder. It's still beautiful. The creek still runs clear and the view of the mountains is exactly as I remembered. We'll build again, Margaret promised. Not the same as before, but something new. Something for Henry, and for any brothers or sisters who might come along. Hayes smiled at that, his hand resting gently on her middle where their second child, not yet announced to anyone else, had just begun to make its presence known. Cooper Ranch, he said, testing the name. Has a good sound to it. The winter of 1877-1878 was spent planning. Maps covered their dining table Foster Creek Ranch on one side, the newly acquired Wyoming property on the other. They plotted construction schedules, breeding programs, cattle drives, financial projections. Henry, now a curious 2-year-old, added his own contributions in the form of colorful scribbles across their careful calculations. When spring arrived, they were ready. The family traveled to Wyoming together, bringing a small crew of trusted hands to begin the work of rebuilding. The journey was Margaret's first major trip since coming to Nebraska as a child, and she found herself exhilarated by the changing landscapes, the bustling towns along the railroad, the endless possibilities stretching before them. The Wyoming property, which Hayes had only described in words, took her breath away when she finally saw it. Nestled in a valley with mountains rising majestically to the west, it possessed a wild beauty different from the rolling prairies of Nebraska, but equally compelling. I can see why you never forgot this place, she told Hayes as they stood on a rise overlooking the land that was now theirs. Henry perched on his father's shoulders, pointing excitedly at an eagle soaring overhead. It was home, Hayes said simply, first one I ever knew. And now it will be again. Margaret linked her arm through his. For all of us. The construction of the new main house began immediately, supervised by Hayes while Margaret oversaw the establishment of corrals, fencing, and outbuildings. By midsummer, the basic structure was complete, a sturdy 2-story building of local stone and timber, designed to withstand Wyoming's harsh winters and complement the natural beauty of its setting. Their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose, was born in that house in late August, arriving with characteristic Cooper timing, just as the roof was completed. Unlike her brother's birth, which had been attended by friends and neighbors, Elizabeth's entry into the world was a more intimate affair, with only Hayes and a local midwife present. She has your spirit, Hayes told Margaret as they gazed at their newborn daughter, her small face framed by wisps of honey blonde hair. Strong and determined, Margaret smiled tiredly. "And your sense of dramatic timing." As autumn approached, they faced the decision they had been postponing. Which property would be their primary home? Foster Creek was established, profitable, connected to a community they had come to love. Cooper Ranch was new, full of potential but also challenges, linked to Hayes's past in ways both healing and painful. "We don't have to choose permanently," Hayes suggested as they discussed the matter one evening. "Not yet. We could divide our time between them, at least for now." Margaret considered this, rocking Elizabeth gently while Henry played with wooden blocks on the floor nearby. 6 months at each place. Winters in Nebraska, summers in Wyoming. Hayes nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Richardson can handle Foster Creek when we're away, and we'll find someone equally capable for here." "It's unconventional," Margaret acknowledged, "but then, so are we." And so began their pattern of seasonal migration: spring and summer at Cooper Ranch in Wyoming, fall and winter at Foster Creek in Nebraska. The arrangement, initially viewed as temporary, proved surprisingly workable. The properties flourished under their alternating attention, each developing distinct specialties. Foster Creek became known for its superior horses, Cooper Ranch for its exceptionally hardy cattle bred to thrive in Wyoming's challenging terrain. The years passed in a rhythm of growth, change, and deepening bonds. Henry grew into a thoughtful boy who shared his father's affinity for the land and his mother's quiet determination. Elizabeth developed into a spirited young girl with a natural talent for horsemanship that exceeded even Margaret's. A third child, Thomas James, joined the family in 1881, completing their circle with his sunny disposition and curious mind. The towns near both ranches evolved as well. Red Cloud expanded with the railroad's growth, while the small settlement near Cooper Ranch, originally little more than a trading post, developed into a proper town with a school, church, and growing business district. Through it all, Margaret and Hayes remained partners in the truest sense, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating successes, adapting to changes with resilience and creativity. The love that had begun in an auction house when a cowboy stood up for a woman who had lost her courage deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. In the spring of 1884, 10 years after they first met, Hayes and Margaret stood together on the porch of Cooper Ranch, watching their children play in the meadow below. Henry, now 9, supervised as Elizabeth taught 5-year-old Thomas to fly a kite in the Wyoming breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked, leaning against Hayes's solid presence. "That day in Riverton when you stood up for a stranger." Hayes's arm tightened around her waist. "Never. I was just trying to do one right thing after years of drifting." He glanced down at her, the lines around his eyes crinkling with his smile. "Turned out to be the best decision of my life." "Mine too," Margaret replied, thinking of how close she had come to surrendering that day, to losing everything that mattered. "Even when I lost my courage, you found it for both of us." "You never lost it," Hayes corrected gently. "You just needed someone to stand beside you while you remembered how brave you really were." Margaret turned in his arms, facing the man who had transformed from mysterious stranger to beloved husband over the course of their shared journey. At 45, Hayes Cooper had silver threading through his dark hair and weather lines etched into his face, but his blue eyes remained as clear and steady as the day they met. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saying not today." Hayes smiled, the expression now coming easily to him after years of happiness had melted away the guardedness of his earlier life. "Thank you for giving me a reason to say it." As they stood together, Watching their children laugh in the golden afternoon light, Margaret reflected on the long, unlikely road that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate flight from Red Cloud to the confrontation at Foster Creek, from rebuilding Hayes's family legacy to creating a unique life spanning two territories, they had faced each challenge together. The woman who had once lost her courage at auction had found not only her strength, but a love that sustained and inspired her. The cowboy who had stood up when no one else would had discovered a home and purpose beyond his solitary quest for redemption. And in that realization, as the Wyoming wind carried the sound of their children's laughter across the land that would be their legacy, Margaret and Hayes found the most precious truth of all. Sometimes the greatest courage is simply opening your heart to love, and the greatest redemption is found in creating a family where once there was only loss. For the Coopers, the journey that began with two simple, defiant words in an auction house had led to a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined. Not a perfect life, for no real life ever is, but one built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and enduring love. And that, they both knew, was more than enough. It was everything.